let's talk about Dark Sun, campaign setting box set, first edition. This is from 1991. It is by Troy Denning and Timothy B. Brown. Troy Denning's name comes up occasionally in that era of TSR, Dungeons and Dragons. Timothy Brown's less so. They're both fairly minor authors. It's surprising actually that they were the big authors for this, I think. Dark Sun was originally created as War World, as a campaign setting to support the battle systems miniatures rules, second edition that they'd put out, but evolved in production and then certainly in its actual release period into the grimdark, we might call it now, ecological horror story of a world which has been, much of the life has been sucked out of it. And everything's bad, you know, all the cities are ruled by evil sorcerer kings whose magic damages the earth. It was also a major place for psionics, and so it's a place, you know, this idea of mind over matter, the breaking, decaying world around you, and you're trying to conquer it. Lots of survival rules, you know, big emphasis on water, food, things like that. So that was the theme, and it's a generally considered a very iconic setting. It released also in 4th edition. There was a fairly small release of a core book, a monster catalogue, and a couple of adventures, essentially. Well, 3 if you include an encounters, D&D encounters one. These are the 2 main books. That is a single painting by Brom, and it's not the most Brom-like art ever, but it's pretty nice. You know, if you know this channel, you know I like Brom. It consists of 2 rulebooks, a story with a couple of notes on how to use the adventure, which we'll get to in a second, and 2 monsters. It comes with 2 odd little flip books, which are an adventure, and it comes with some gumph at the back, which we won't bother with, but it comes with a map of the city of Tyr. That, and a map of the Tyr region of Dark Sun, so Athas, and the Tyr region is the heartland which the first edition box set is. To be clear, first edition is released during second edition's production period, but there was a revised campaign set. So this is original Dark Sun, let's call it. It's 2-sided. You've got that side, which is a generally quite nice map, and then you've got, I think that's a player-friendly hex map as well on the back. I think it's lightly keyed, but yeah. So you've got something for travel and for the players to see there. So the revised edition, the main differences, there's some rules differences to do with how magic works, and a few other things that happen to do with the rules. But the big thing was that the setting and the timeline was expanded. The timeline was after the big metaplot events of the first set of adventures, which do change the world in some respects significantly, and more beneficially and less controversially. As in, that's controversial. The bit that's not controversial is the revised edition has a lot more, a far bigger world that it details, and kind of goes beyond the Tyr region, building in stuff from some of the books that have been released as well as new information. So yeah, this is the original though. This is the one we're looking at, and this is in many respects the one that I think is right to recommend as the first point of call. What I'll do is I will I will go through each of these major bits in here and do a bit of an overview of them, and just try to say this as boringly, this is what I like, this is what is less good for me, and try to make some observations about both the way the design works, how it's been designed, and maybe what's needed to kind of build from it. I should say it's worth looking at the back. It promises a skull, and I don't know if anyone else got a skull of a Thri-kreen, but I mean possibly there's like a ban on ivory imports from Athos, but I didn't get a skull. But yeah, you get 3 new PC races, 3 new PC classes, and more powerful PCs. I think it's really interesting, a good reminder that TSR realised that players buy stuff more than DMs buy stuff. No, that's not true in one way. DMs tend to buy more, but there are more players. And so hence why Player's Handbook, the PHBR line, is so important. There's so many entries in it. Hence why increasingly you see for Birthright Players Secrets books, which are essentially setting books and adventure books, but aimed at the player, which the DM then has to approve or disapprove. Very strange, not particularly functional game model, but not a bad commercial model potentially. Obviously, we don't know, or TSR's numbers during that era are very funny financially. But yeah, here this is a setting which has a strong feel and which is aimed at the idea that players want tough, big, crazy characters with new options. The rulebook is where we're going to get most of that in terms of the mechanical stuff. You get a bit of mechanical stuff in terms of monsters in the Wanderer's Journal, which is the setting book. But the rulebook is basically where you should start in lots of ways to understand the basic idea of the game. So you have chapter 1. There are 15 chapters. Ability scores is chapter 1. And here the base ability score rolling is technically the base ability score roll in second edition is actually 3d6 in order. But if you're to use Gary's preferred method from first edition, it'd be 4d6, drop the lowest of those, and then arrange as you like amongst your abilities. Here, 4d4 plus 4, 6 times in order. So you're going to get at least 8 every time, and on average, you're going to be getting 12, 13 as your lower end average, and then you've got racial modifiers as well and stuff. So you can get, as it says on the back, you can get racial score. You can get ability scores of up to 20 depending on the exact build you end up with. Basically, a half giant can get 24 in strength. That's the gimmick. There are optional methods. Ability scores. This a bit like copying the Oriental Adventures model, which is touched on again in Spelljammer and in Al-Qadim in Arabian Adventures. There's a sort of parallel Player's Handbook thing here. Unlike Oriental Adventures, these other ones do say you really do need this other book, whereas OA kind of becomes its own Player's Handbook. But player character races is the next thing, and one big thing you do see, I think it's fair to say, is that half giants get +4 strength, +2 con, and then -2 to 3, or all 3 of their intellectual stats. What you can see immediately is that you've got wide ranges of ability and disability here of basically weakness and strength. You then have kind of class charts, languages, etc. And you can see there's some interesting things about what races can be what class or whatever. But then we get to the races, and one of the things, that is a Brom dwarf. I quite like that dwarf actually. One thing you see is that the first point of reinvention, that is a Brom elf. I'm looking. Steve Baxter is the other black and white artist who goes for a much more taut and lumpy look, which some people don't like. I do. Brom's black and white line art in the book is generally amazing. I think it's fair to say. And I think though Baxter is also a common Darksun artist, Brom is identifiably the Darksun artist in a way that Dieterlitzy is for Planescape. But yeah, you've got these very distinctive ancestries that are not what you get in the realms. Like dwarves and elves and stuff are not the same thing. You are talking about a different fantasy world. It is a different flavour of fantasy. And this is an immediate success, triumph, whatever you want to call it, where immediately you get recognisable types, but with not just a twist, but Birthright gives things a bit of a twist, but a complete spin, Dwarves are incredibly focused, hard workers, but to the point that they actually have a whole thing about, they have focuses. They need to obsess about something and really aim to do it and finish it. While they're performing tasks directly related to their focus, they receive +1 to all saves, +2 to all proficiency, or +10, 20 percentile. And mechanically, that is a very interesting and different kind of thing. And of course, that one thing that means is that they're not experts at stonework. What they get instead is when they have that dwarvish idea where they build deep halls of stone. They're great miners. Not as relevant in Athos, but what you get is that work ethic feel of the dwarf transformed into a different mechanical effect, which is actually, I think this is where you see the way in which one half of the OSR, I guess, has grasped and taken on this idea of mechanics forming worldview in terms of the way the game lives and feels, is that, yeah, you get strong race classes, and that's a strong race class ability. Elves are dune-running tribal nomads, and they still get bonuses to longbows and swords. They do have infravision. They don't have special knowledge of secret or concealed doors. They don't have special resistance to spells. They gain a surprise bonus in the wilderness. So they are kind of low trust, slightly roguish elves, very different elves to your classic high elf. Of course, in that way, they're actually a good takeover of the Fey outsider type or trope of elf, transported to the desert. Half elves are they are quite different, I guess, to your expectation of the normal high fantasy half elf as a diplomat. They are less well liked. They're rejected really by everyone, but they are flexible for character class. They gain survival and they get pets. They're very self-reliant and independent because they are rejected. Rather than being accepted by both sides as a diplomat, they are rejected. Half giants, one of the new races, ancestries, and a very literally strong one, but this is again this strong race class concept. They're not race classes, but you get what I'm getting at, where you suddenly not just you got this enormous strength bonus, but also they're 12 feet tall and could be like 1,500 pounds. They're everything, their stuff, their personal stuff costs double. They double hit die rolls no matter what their character class. They are basically too big to get into stuff, and they have to switch one half of their alignment every day. There is a way in which, of course, this can all become, that particular thing you'd be like, man, could that break games? Given the kind of stuff you get in Athos and the implied adventures, no. But I love the idea that you've got a PC that is just too big to get in places, but also could have strength 24. You can have a hill giant walk around with you, basically. Halflings are from the one rainforest area in Athos. Generally speaking, that's their tribal origins. Very clannish, very, very strong, rich culture, but see everything as food, including sentience. Then again, the sense of them being outsiders, halflings, and there are big meta plot reasons for all this stuff actually. But with halflings, you can see that there is this kind of alien culture thing, which means they are a twist on the burglar and sneaky type, same resistance to magic, resistance to poison, talon with slings and thrown weapons. But the fact that they are like the elves, they are taking, and like the dwarves, they're taking a familiar element and then saying what happens in the desert, and then making, I think, a familiar trope actually, well, both unfamiliar but also stronger. The actual familiar trope is made stronger, not weaker. Humans, mules are half dwarves, and they are mostly, the biggest thing apart from their stat changes is they are just incredibly good. They don't need to sleep for ages. They can do heavy labour for 24 plus con hours before they need to have an 8-hour rest, and then they're fully rested. So that does mean that they can run for, let's say their con is 14, 38 hours without any exhaustion penalties. And then the other, that's a new race, and the other new ancestral race is Thrycreen, who I think existed before this. Possibly. I'm not sure. Did they pop up here for the first time, maybe? But they are, again, a tribal insectoid race. You gotta, I think that must be back, so looking at it, glancing at it. Yeah. Or the heavy, dense pencil work gives him away, whereas Brom's line work is incredibly light, intentionally light. But yeah, Thrycreen, they are like other non-human races you get occasionally, like the Zixtran and the Rastopedes in Spelljammer are the most obvious one. but where they just have a bunch of weird abilities like natural armor, natural attacks. They can leap forward a certain distance. They have venomous saliva. They have special weapon things. They can dodge missiles. But they, they're also just awkward. They're awkward shapes. You can't really improve their armor, I don't think. They do have marginal antenna vision, which is they lessen any darkness or blindness based activities in like brush and grassland by 1 or by 5%. So that is like an amazing array of ideas. I think it's really fun, and straight away that it's not quite the price of admission. If you imagine you're buying a whole box set, but immediately you can feel like this world is going to be very different. And the classes continue that. Now, probably there's less worth saying about the classes up front. Some of them there is, but they are again virtually all classes if you know second edition, but with a big twist. Warriors, so fighter. The fighter is a fighter, except their real speciality is they gain the ability as they level up to command troops. They get command points in the battle system game. Fighters are and they can make heavy war machines. They are made for this kind of war side of the game. Gladiators they basically know all weapons. They are proficient in every weapon. They are never non-proficient, and so they can specialize in multiple weapons. As the flip side to that, they know great at unarmed combat, great with armor. Rangers are they're actually pretty similar to base rangers, in fact, though they are, I think they're demi clerics rather than demi druids, but they are pretty similar to core rangers. Wizards, this is where you get the environmental theme come up for the first time. You can be a defiler. Well, a preserver is a wizard by the rules who doesn't damage the environment. The defiler has special rules for draining the environment of life. The upside to him cheating is that he levels up much quicker. 1750, 3500, 7000 for the first 3 levels you're leveling up. And illusionists are also there, who can be preservers or defilers, but are otherwise basically illusionists. 3 types of priests. Clerics. Clerics are clerics of the elements because there are no gods. The gods are dead or never existed. They are, they are an elemental cleric of earth, air, fire, water. Druids. They're actually pretty similar to core druids, but they are tied to a particular area of land, which is theirs to protect. And they have major access to spells from any sphere associated with their guarded lands. And so the guarded lands they have create a specialized druid, possible, and they give examples of that. And there are, speaking with plants, shape changing, things like that. Templars are the final type of cleric. They are technically negative energy clerics who receive their powers as boons from the evil sorcerer kings they serve. So they are warlocks, basically, in 5th edition parlance. Rogues, you've got bards, who are bards but specialists at poison, and thieves, who are pretty much just thieves. There is also a slightly expanded change or set of rules for psionicists, who are very important in Dark Sun, because psionics, where magic is heavily restricted, and where where arcane magic is heavily restricted by law, and where clerical magic is maybe not as heavily restricted, but certainly in the remit of cities, in the realm of cities, is naturally limited in some ways. Psionics becomes a very important way of people being powerful, particularly those who would have formal power and would like to protect themselves, but can't just all become wizards, so nobles and things like that. There are both class and multi-class restrictions, as you'd expect. There's some fun ones. I think I always enjoy fun, weird multi-class combos. One thing is that everyone can be a psionicist here, and everyone in fact can have a psionic wild talent. But also that means you get lots of kind of psionicist combos, including triple classes. Like the classic triple classer, of course, is the elf, but here the dwarf can be a fighter cleric psionicist. The Thri-Kreen cleric psionicist, that's a pretty fun one. A half giant can also be a cleric psionicist. I think their cleric level though is really low, if I remember rightly. That's one thing, is that I think some of the potential race class combinations kind of suck. Like you're disincentivized against them more than you would be on average. Half giants are cleric 12, fighter 16, gladiator 14, sign assist unlimited, or ranger 8. You can see ranger is unattractive in that context, especially if you're starting at 3rd level. If it's a serious campaign, you're actually starting at 3rd, not super unlikely to hit 8th, all told. Then you get character trees. Big idea is that you have 4 characters who have a shared point of alignment, and you can swap them between adventures, or when a character you're controlling dies. So basically they are a way of having extra sheets in the DM's hand, but they're people you've developed who have shared aims, and there is what you can level up an inactive character whenever your active character levels up, I think is the way it works. So that's fun. I think having talked to players, they love that idea. They're like, man, that's a really interesting idea. It's different to the way I've run stables in other games, and it's not the way that Gary describes stables in the 1E DMG. Alignment stuff gives some rules about severe desperation to do with how that people behave when thirsty and things like that. Then proficiencies. There's just a bag of new proficiencies. Somatic concealment for wizards to hide themselves, which is to hide them moving. Some of the art is, that's a quite nice Brom piece in some ways, but some of the art is a bit weird. I suppose, is that meant to be, I don't know, bargain? Though the art is good, I like Brom and I like Baction. There's lots of good Brom, particularly in here, has a lot of pieces. It's not actually a heavily decorated book. It's bigger on this, call it the Black Sands of Socorro style background. Birthright does a similar thing where there's lots of layout design choices to trick you into thinking there's more art than there is. Like a lot of this into the 90s era, we're into double column, which easier to read, fewer words. Both of the books are 96 pages for what it's worth as well, both the main books. But yeah, these are heat protection, water find. They are relevant, and to the degree that you see NWPs, I think NWPs are a far more interesting way of doing skills than D20 system onwards, unified skill system kind of thing where you roll it. I think the fact that they are much more specific makes them much more interesting. Money and equipment. Big gimmick here for money and equipment, other than a few new things to buy, is that everything non-metallic, non-metal costs 1% of its normal cost. Metal costs the same, but you generate your money in the 1%, like in coppers, basically, in ceramic pieces. They can then be split further into bits, so into fractions of ceramic pieces of coppers functionally, and that's fun in terms of that's a clever, efficient way without changing the money system actually into talking about this metal poor world and giving you the flavour of that, and also in terms of giving you a mechanical measurement and incentive, as a set of incentives as well, to do with why metal weaponry is so good, which you get in this, in that section, and in combat, the rules about the big thing being non-metal weapons. Well, a few things. Non-metal weapons tend to break quicker, or have penalties, or have potential downsides and weaknesses. Metal armor is really strong, but does get really hot, and that sucks. So there's kind of a bit of a give and take on those things. Priestly magic with new sphere rules, wizardly magic rules, including like how much damage you do depending on the area of kind of place you are. You do very little damage in a forest in terms of space, because life is so concentrated. You only need a small amount of space to suck out of it. New experience awards, which is parallel to the DMG ones, sorry, but adds a bunch. Fighters get bonuses for their war machine kind of stuff. Gladiators get it for those creatures defeated in the arena. Clerics get stuff to do with using an element creatively. Druids do with defeating defilers. Priests, we actually finally get an official priests getting XP per spell level for spells cast, which is not in the core and it's obviously a confusion. There's obviously a gap there that probably accidental. There's also race awards. I think I like individual class awards. Remember that individual class awards and I guess race awards are Zeb Cook trying to rationalise. Use me fun Baxter. Individual awards are Zeb Cook trying to rationalise some stuff that you get in the 1E DMG, where Gary says basically rate all your players and multiply their XP fractionally via their rating, or have it or at least you can do that, and you can also change the XP of the monsters they kill depending on if they're a threat, and also you can increase or decrease their training time depending on their quality of play. All this quite subjective stuff that one is politically difficult at a table. You know, Steve, you're crap today. Is not something. Also, sometimes how do you even judge that? But also, it's something which makes it hard for both DM and players, even if everyone has very thick skins. Sometimes to know, you need reliability, you need predictability. It's a rule of law issue, isn't it? And I think not having that and deciding that you're asking the DM to sort of make up the real XP awards is something which is trying to recognise the idea that people should try to play their characters and do things their classes do, etc. But what Cook does is say, okay, if that's the idea, is they should do things that their class and indeed race should do, let's just give class awards. And in fact, I think that works fairly well. I think it is not story XP as long as it's measurable and mechanical, and it doesn't necessarily encourage super destructive habits. Especially if you allow defeat to include surrender and things like that. Rout and surrender being ways of getting XP. I'm less convinced in this. I mean, I think here you start to get very specific things and things which are intelligent mechanical incentives towards role playing. Intelligent in the sense that they understand that people do stuff because there are such things as incentives, but I'm not sure that I am excited by the idea of either tracking them, or as excited as I could be at least, tracking them, or like players feeling like they need to do that. So to be fair, Thry-Kreen, per missile dodged is easy and measurable and quite fun. Half Giants, imitate charismatic friend, 20 XP per day. Mools, heavy exertion, 50 XP per 12 hours. Yeah, those are both kind of measurable, but in another way, you're like, I guess, how far is this driving a player towards making stuff up? Imitating a charismatic friend is a lot less valid a mechanical activity, not a bad role playing thing, but than getting extra loot or defeating an enemy. But there we are. So you'll take that or leave that. There's then some extra bits and clarifications on battling undead and ways that works, arena combat rules, types of armor, including piecemeal armor, the idea that you can have a base and then improve it based on bits you find. Very video game-ish, isn't it? Slightly different treasure tables, some stuff about but things that don't exist, potions of dragon control, for instance, Bucknard's Everfull Purse. There are special rules about using berries and fruits as potions. That's fun. New magical items, there are 4. They're not particularly exciting. Rod of Divining, I guess, is at least a decent gag. And then stuff about encounters. Then it has encounter charts. Mention it basically using MC1 and 2 and the monsters in this box, and basically that's not super adequate because you're still not getting a large number of it tells you a variety of things, I should say, that might be appropriate, but you don't get a large number of distinctively Dark Sun monsters, and Dark Sun massively benefits from having a distinctive monster cast. And then there are a few pages of new spells, and a bit of time. To be fair, time and movement, and stuff to do with travel is relevant. There's a short thing about NPCs, but vision and light and time and movement are relevant, and pretty relevant, I'd say, because you've got stuff about how dehydration works and water consumption, movement by night and advantages of that. And given that it is one thing that in the PHB for 2E and the DMG, you get sometimes weird missing bits of information, or things are in different places. I think that's for all they are not horrendously organised, there are definitely still some odd organisational decisions. Just having it all repeated isn't the worst thing. Interestingly, you're still not, I think, you still don't have anything about lacking food, just dehydration. Because here's the thing, there are virtually no actual starvation rules in 1st or 2nd edition D&D. You need the Wilderness Survival Guide to get the nearest thing to a detailed system in the main books that I've seen. There may well be a system somewhere, but in the main books, it's Kim Moen's Wilderness Survival Guide that has it. A few new spells at the back, Sonic Dampener, interpretation on plant growth, interpretation on wall vice, etc. Doom Legion, a 7th level necromancy spell, which creates skeletons from a battlefield. Create Tree of Life. You can't call woodland beings. Nothing actually that exciting. You know, it's useful to have interpretations. Some of those are interesting gimmicks. So the rulebook, very, very strong if you like rules, and I do. Wanderer's Journal, 96 pages, of which 84 are about the world, the rest are, so the remaining 12 are about animals. And basically, I'll pick out a few moments, but the big summary I want to give is basically that this is too long in terms of what you're getting. It's double column, so it's not as dense as triple column, but also everything's just overwritten, a bit bland. There's a degree of repetition. You're getting a lot of stuff about the world, and it's not. A big thing is, and this time you see it in World of Darkness books, you see it in Star Wars books, even D6 books, you see it in everything at the time. Deadlands, stuff where occasionally you get a pretty good writer, but very often you've got pretty average writers, even if they're on the decent side of average, who are writing quite long books, increasingly in character. And this is what we're getting here. This is an in-character book by The Wanderer, and The Wanderer feels almost directly a prototype of some Deadlands and D6 Star Wars narrators for books. It feels like to me. He may not be the prototype. There will be earlier ones, I'm sure. But this fairly bland first-person character, the occasion, this is because it's a book aimed at the players, not at the DM. The DM is using it as well to get ideas, and occasionally they'll be like, "Oh, whether or not this legend is true, I don't know." And that, of course, is because it's leaving space for the DM to decide. But it does mean there's nothing directly gameable in there other than the monsters. There's no dungeons. There's no NPC stats. There's no direct mechanics for things that are happening there. There's occasionally, I should say, in the terrain section of Thasian Geography, there are implied rules for what's it called? There are implied rules for how certain things will happen. Like, I think there's one example which says that you're 50% as likely to find this here. You know, I would estimate you're 50% as likely to find it here. That is a rule being hidden behind the first person in character text. Basically, I don't think it's very good. I think the actual information, the world is interesting and good. I think the presentation is a waste of pages that we could have had lots of other things in instead, including dungeons. Remember, you've got 84 pages. Why not cut that to 42 pages and then have the other 42 be dungeons, NPCs, and more monsters? That'd be a much more valuable book. The actual stuff is good. It is a rich world. The setting is great. I like the darkness is great. The difficulty of these evil sorcerer kings, and certainly the stuff that's not in the book but outside the book that you pick up. You know, it is an amazing world. The way they present the ancestries again in here is great. The class is great. The actual geography, the chapter 3 of Thasian Geography and chapter 4 Atlas of the Tier region, are both, in terms of though they are overlong, as I've said, in terms of the actual invention, are great, and in terms of the things you can set up and see happening, including there are sections in each area of the atlas which, like, these are local kinds of ruins that you could go and see. For instance, ruins in the What section are we in on this? So this is actually on the in the tier region itself. So there is a separate ruins section. Each of these subsections gets ruins, and so the big tier region one gets more ruins. You've got the Bleak Tower, Arkhold, Calagne, Bodak, Justenal, Yarramuk. And then you have landmarks: Dragon's Bowl, Mekalot Mountain, Estuary of the Forked Tongue, and the Dragon's Crown Mountain. And these reach a couple of paragraphs, and they're setting up a location which you, the DM, can design. And they are reliably interesting, and the real problem is that they... And the cities as well are reliably interesting. You know, the kind of 5 paragraphs, 6 paragraphs per city are interesting. The problem is just that, particularly for the ruins, as an example, they are meant to be dungeons or adventure settings. The cities are city adventures, so you could see why it might be hard unless you're only detailing one city to get much in. But the Bleak Tower, this circular marble tower, rises more than 100 feet above the surrounding plain. Once a wooden stairway ascended the interior, but it's long since rotted away. Other than the stairway, the tower remains exactly as it stood for at least 1,000 years. Not a stone has fallen from its wall. From its crown, a magical lantern still casts a macabre green light out over the sea of silt. When the wind stirs up a good dust storm, a loud, painful bellow sounds from the tower at regular intervals. The local natives attribute the roar to the ghost of the tower's lady, who they say lost her betrothed on such a night long ago when the sea of silt was filled with water. That's a great hook. I can imagine it making an adventure out of that. And if that were a paragraph in a zine, and that's part of a gazetteer in Echoes from Fomalhaut, say, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't complain. I would think that was fine. But this is something in a very long book with lots of stuff, some of which is pretty good. It's rich with ideas, and that itself is rich with ideas. But I just think when you've got the word count and the production kind of money, you just need to give me something more than that. You need to give me the adventure, or at least the adventure outline. But that's compromised, as I say, by the need to aim at the player as the key audience for buying stuff. And increasing, therefore, the non-player, the person who just buys stuff and enjoys reading it, and that's great. But you're therefore no longer writing it for anyone who's actually going to play a game. More positively, the monsters, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 monster entries in MC, Monstrous Compendium format. Here, not as separate sheets. The first Dark Sun Monstrous Compendium is separate sheets. This is part of the meta of the Monstrous Compendium system. For all its relative strengths and weaknesses in itself, is also just that the way monsters got published, especially in setting box sets, was just random. You know, you sometimes had separate fold outs, you sometimes had cards, like in Birthright, you sometimes have them integrated here. Here you actually have 2 sets of monsters integrated, because there's also the Klucht and the Weezer, and the Weezer is actually quite a good monster, in the back of the fiction piece. The fiction piece is fine, by the way. But yeah, the big triumph anyway, that is a complaint about the way in which there's no single systematic format of how they publish stuff in the early to late 90s, but basically 89 to 2000. There's no real logic for how they publish stuff to do with monsters, and it does make it quite hard to access stuff. Using Mojo Bob Online is frankly a lot easier. But animal domestic, so looking at the animals domestic is a good example of why Dark Sun works, even though you've only got these 11 entries at this point, is that the flora, fauna, and that's one thing about the atlas, is the description of weird types of flora particularly, even though there's no mechanical effects, it's just really fun, and you're like, oh, there's so many ideas for what could happen there. As well as the actual weird mysteries of the different places that you're told about or that are hinted at. But the fact that your domestic animals are Erdlu are emus, Kank are large docile insects who, you know, you can ride around. Mechalots and Inix are lizards. Inix are, I think, kind of, what would they be like? They're like a giant lizard or something, like a giant bearded dragon or whatever. Mechalots are enormous, like 6-ton mound-shaped bodies, or, you know, almost like slightly savage tortoises. they're all fun. The fact that that's what would survive on this world. The only mammals I can think of being mentioned. It is weird. Occasionally, you can see the slip between the author and the world, where there's an implication there are such things as mammals other than the sentient race ancestries, but you never, like, basically there aren't any. There are small rodents up in the rainforest. You've got the Belgoi, who are a low intelligence, lawful evil humanoid. The Braxat is a psionic neutral evil carnivore. The Dragon of Tyr, well, therein lies a mystery, but he is unique, 32 HD, 250 hit points. Yeah, his Thaco is -3, so if you're thinking to basically mess up the maths, but essentially he's a +23 to hit, if you want to put it that way. Yeah, he is the big bad you get in the core box set. Obviously, he's on a page here. Dune Freaks, also neutral evil. Well, omnivores, but again, they're kind of has it out there. Gadge. So there's the Dune Freak. There's the Gadge. I think a lot of these are, yeah, a lot of the monsters are Baxter. That is an iconic Brom line drawing. Love that one. But yeah, a lot of the monsters are Baxter. Yeah, Belgoi is, Braxat is, Dragon. Maybe they all are. But yeah, so the Gadge is a reptile who resembles a beetle who can blow up your mind. The Athasian giant, who is slightly different to the normal giant, variable alignment. Gith, who, they're not proto-Gith. Canonically, there are like things about where they come from, but they are functionally proto-Gith. They are Giths are Gith Yankee. They are average intelligence, chaotic evil humanoids who are again a bit of a problem. Chaotic neutral, non-human sentient, the Jojhal. Silkworm, who's obviously, because there aren't dragons apart from the Dragon of Tyr, your Silkworm is a dragonette. It is something that is a gigantic. It's a snake with a hard chitinous shell that measures over 50 feet in length. Has a fairly weak psionics in that case, only shadow form, but that's pretty annoying as an individual psionic power for a predator to have. But yeah, the Jojhal are, they are 4 hit dice, but have a ton of spells and a ton of psionic stuff. The Gith have, again, they are a basic opponent. They're a 3 hit die humanoid, and when you're starting at 3rd level, that means they are a basic opponent. I feel like there was, yeah, the Belgoi is a 5 hit die opponent. But the fact that loads of these have some telepathy, some psionics, I think there is a thing where it points you towards something which not everyone's going to want to do, but which is something the setting leans into, and well, I think, and there is a good psionics, a couple of psionic, I guess 3 technically, supplements for Dark Sun, but particularly the Will and the Way is a good Psionicist class supplement to go on top of PHBR5 Psionics Handbook. The idea that there is lots of use for psionic powers, and that I just don't buy that Psionics is just a random add-on. I don't buy Gary when he says that about what happens in the 1E DMG. I think that is because he wasn't happy with the rules afterwards. He ended up being like, oh well, that was never what I intended. But you see the amount of thought that goes into it in the Psionics issue of Dragon, and you see that Gary keeps adapting them in his own games later on, post-TSR. I think, Psionics are a system that requires extra thought and work. It requires good players who are willing to learn rules, and it requires a DM willing to spin another plate. But I think Dark Sun, much like it gives a tiny bit more scope to battle system, it also gives a lot of scope to Psionics, and so it is a world, as well as its rich setting, which via its design cues is pushing you to explore these weird corners and gives you the tools to do that. Little knowledge is the adventure as well as the story. The remaining 2 monsters. The Weezer is cool because they are they're a non-intelligent hive insect, social flying insect, but just, yeah, they are a reasonably, it sounds funny, they are just essentially, they're just a giant flying ant or something, but there's just something about the ways they're described and the way they work in the adventure, which is quite rich for me, I think. So finally, the final book to look at. I've skipped a lot of the Wanderer's Journal, not because I don't like the setting, but because I don't want to read relatively bland flavour text. You know, the point is, it's a great setting, great ideas. The Adventure, an introductory adventure set beneath the dark sun, with a coloured version of that iconic Brom line drawing. In this case, the line drawing might be superior. Now, this is, you'll notice, in a funny format called the flipbook format. Basically, it's that the players have a set of cards in front of them, and you, the DM, have, this is your book, your adventure, behind the screen. So, when you're told to, I think, actually this is just where it starts, there's no number in it. When you're told to, you turn to the relevant page. It's a mechalot wagon, or a wagon being pulled by mechalots. That is the interior of your mechalot wagon that you're in. There's a map you find. With caveats, I actually think this is a really interesting idea as a format. I have run 3 Dark Sun adventures using flipbook formats when I ran a Dark Sun campaign back in the day, and I think what was the improvement on this was that because I was actually printing them out, I had copies and I was printing them out so that the players had individual pieces of paper, and that actually worked quite well, I think, in practice, because it meant they weren't flicking back and forth. These are also smaller than if you blow them up at 4 times onto an A4 page or something. But yeah, it's a nice idea, and the actual things in this are mostly quite good. They're inspiring art and game resources. It's not really necessary, but it's no less necessary and no less good than the player foldouts in Barrier Peaks, for instance. The DM book is it has a similar format where you are numbered. You go through different pages, and it says, if you need to use this encounter, go to this page, and by page they mean 3 elves, for instance. Now, here's the thing with A Little Knowledge itself. When I first read A Little Knowledge, I was like, there's some interesting ideas in that. I like the fact they want to have strong survival elements, but I don't think it's very good. It seems really linear. It is an adventure where the characters are slaves in a slave wagon, and the slave wagon ends up getting derailed, and they have to survive in the desert. But there are lots of cues which, from page 1, which immediately kind of give you the sense that it's very linear. 1, Mechalot Caravan. Next, don't take too long with this encounter. When the PCs are about to break free of the hold, or when it appears they aren't going to try, continue with encounter 2. 3, Elves. If the players have more than 2 quarts of water apiece, or return to the wagon to see what they can salvage, continue with encounter 4. Otherwise, continue with encounter 5. And what's another good example of the same thing? Some are just 1 to the next. 8 goes to continue with encounter 9. There's a couple like that through. I think they're worse at the start, but there are a couple more cues like that, and a couple of comments actually on what NPCs do, which pointing towards the idea that there's a way this story has to work, and that's bad. That is a bad way to play a game. The story has to work like this. The players have to enjoy the story, and any real enjoyment or player choice is just from providing. The point is they think there's a world they can explore, but there's not really. I think if you tell players your choices are limited to these things, that's the kind of game it is. Fair enough. We do that in chess. But if players think there's a world, then there should be a world, I think, at some level. But on rereading it, I actually concluded it's a really good adventure. It's a really good small adventure. It is half the size or less of the full-length Dark Sun Adventures, DS1 Freedom, and I forget what they call it, DSQ1 Road to Uruk, DSQ2 Arcane Shadows, DSQ3 Asticlian Gambit is the first run of 4, which ends in the Dragon's Crown Epic. Those are much longer. Dragon's Crown, again, is much longer again. This is shorter, but the basic idea, if you just blow it out onto a map and say this with maybe a tiny bit of flexibility for where certain things can be found, you might choose, if you want to actually use the stuff in the adventure, to let some stuff be very slightly quantum. I think you could get away without doing that, but I'm saying yes, you can have something be in 2 possible locations rather than 1, if the players could choose to go in one direction rather than the other. Or rather, if they go south, they will encounter this encounter wherever they are on the map. If they go north, they won't. That's what I mean. But if you bear that in mind and say, well, you blow it out, you're something like, well, there's a setup, it's a campaign setup, players will accept a tiny degree of railroad. If it's like, you're attacked, you are slaves and you're attacked, players will accept that. You loosen the timing, you have elves turn up, you have, you have other stuff happen, you've got rules about desert travel, and you let that, partly because that is something where, one of those cases where you can kind of tell that you're being prompted to play in a particular way. You just play that as if it's a proper wilderness adventure. You have the encounters like, well, so to be fair, it has cactus food juice this encounter the first time the PCs enter an area of stony barrens, and then six is it's there to prove to players how bad things are. You just put number 6, bloody timorous, into the right kind of terrain. You have the Weezers is a dungeon basically, and it even has not exciting but not bad. It's a perfectly interesting dungeon map. You could add a couple of bits into it. This little insect hive, it's a termite mound basically, and I think the point is you're going to want to go there because there are wax balls of water and balls of honey there. There's resources there. You don't have to go there, but that's something you might like to do because there's a big advantage. You also don't have to fight the Brood Queen. But yeah, one thing is that these are made linear, but you can just have them be locations. And the challenge there is if they're out in the wilderness and you don't make it linear, then your players are going to miss stuff, and that's fine. That's completely fine. Except you need to then have more stuff. You need to, if you're going to make this a true sandbox that they get dumped in the middle of the desert, you need to like double the material, because this is something where it is like at a point where they're in this kind of region, give them this encounter. At a point where they've done this other stuff and they're looking for water, let them find a Weezer nest. And there is an assumption about the way the game works, which if you want to have it be fully sandbox from the point that they're out of the slave wagon, will not hold. They can be attacked by a silkworm, which is that's one thing. This is one of those examples. So 11 Brood Queen. After they leave them, allow them to continue exploring the desert. If they come to a road, this is one thing. This is where actually even the adventure just about moves away from linearity. It says you could go to the road, encounter 12, Oasis, encounter 14, Cled, a town that they might know about, or village, 18. If none of them occur within 2 days, continue with 13. So that is actually, that's actually good adventure writing. What I mean is, it is something where it's saying, look, these are the options on the map. Imagine you didn't have a hex map, so you're just on point on a node crawl. These are the nodes. That's one thing to think is ignore the very nice hex map on the back of this. I don't think you should. I'm just saying that's a way to imagine doing this, that there are nodes and the players can more or less go north, south, east or west. You can meet slaves and the slaves might be willing to befriend you. You could be attacked by a silkworm. That's one thing. That is a preset encounter you just have to deal with. You could find a mechalot at an oasis who doesn't want to let you eat or drink, sorry. You can then, there is then this oasis with a weird ruin in it, and there are elves who turn up. This then sets up those that the elves are in tension with the dwarves and others of Cled. And this sets, so you've got this thing where you can, by going around, either going to the oasis or going to the town of Cled, or meeting the slaves indeed. All these things begin to set up, and indeed potentially meeting, I think, the druid at the oasis as well. All these things begin to set up a further set of tensions. Is that the slave tribe is struggling to find water because there's trouble at Cled, which ties in the faction of slaves with the dwarves at Cled with the elves who are functionally the problem. The elves are making things difficult. You are stuck in a thing where you can actually, 20, you can save an elf princess functionally. You can befriend all these factions. you might become friends with the elves. You might, they're less likely to want to actually be your friends. You might become friends with the dwarves, or particularly the slaves. But and this is something actually that suddenly reminds me of some of the interesting tensions in games like BioWare or The Witcher. There is a maturity to the tension, and it's not a forced one. It's not a kind of ridiculous, either a weird binary, do you want to do the evil thing or the good thing, nor is it a completely baroque and over the top crazy thing, which, to be fair, sometimes you get in The Witcher. Rather, the tension is one where these factions are acting according to the things they would normally do and normally care about, and it's just that kind of desert elves in their ruin going around raiding stuff. They're difficult, they're eccentric, and they don't get that, they don't want to get along with other people. Life is hard, why would they make it easy for other people and hard for themselves? The point is that the druid of the oasis has been captured by the elves, because he was caught eating an elf and he's being held for execution, and this is making things dangerous. You've got an elf encampment, you've got a little elf dungeon there. Again, a very small map, but it's got a full key. One thing about this format is it forces terseness. It means that they're not wasting time. In that specific sense, Dark Sun Adventures, but particularly this Little Knowledge, are fantastic for curing the writers of second edition habits of coming up with random extra words to fill out the adventure, where the Wanderer's Journal suffers horrendously from being overwritten. The adventure basically doesn't. I want it to be longer in the sense I wanted to have more encounters in it, so there's more stuff in the desert, so that it can be fully sandboxed. But the actual basic things in there are written so incredibly efficiently, and in that sense, maybe there's an argument almost as a writing exercise to force people to write in such a format first. But a Little Knowledge, it once it sets up your players can go in any direction. They've got to deal with legitimate problems in the desert. You've got to track their water, because if you're doing Dark Sun, this stuff has to matter. And then there's like, by the way, life's hard. This isn't, you come upon a village and the village is being attacked by hobgoblins, and the hobgoblins are evil. But there's great treasure there, and you can also befriend the local wizard by rescuing him. No, it's actually that there's elves who just want to live in the desert, who considered the druid thought he was doing a morally neutral thing, eating, using food, legitimate food. The elves see that as an attack on them, but the druid helps the local area, protects things, and the elves are also messing around with the water at the oasis, and this means that those people who are reliant on the water, the slaves and the free slaves, the kind of runaways, and the dwarves that Cled, are screwed over. Well, who's right? Well, you'll probably be like, yeah, I agree with the dwarves and the slave tribe, but that means getting into a war with some elves who otherwise basically aren't particularly dangerous, aren't intending to be malicious. And the diplomatic solutions are implied to be very limited. Now, of course, you should let players explore the limits of that. I think that's better. That is a better game. But it sets up a genuinely hard tension with no easy solutions. But of course, if you do it, you then might have a home base. And so there's also incentives for the players to work out the problem potentially in a morally ambiguous way. So yeah, I think it is a perfect introduction to Dark Sun thematically. I think it has loads of interesting mechanical things. I think it has a genuinely quite fun dungeon, if simple, in the Weezer Nest. It has some solid stuff to do with the elves. It therefore gets in things you'll see in lots of Dark Sun adventures, like here's an overland section, here's a small dungeon, here's another overland section, here's a weird mystery. Is a really common Dark Sun. Here's a tension between a couple of factions that may be both ambiguous. Not every Dark Sun adventure does that, and certainly the first couple don't particularly. The first couple of big ones don't, but that increasingly becomes common, that you have to reconcile different, even from the first one, reconcile tensions and choose factions within a set to get your objective done. So I think it is a successful adventure, and it probably in some ways one of the better Dark Sun adventures. So overall, I think it's a great box. I think it suffers from, apart from specific layout and formatting issues like two of the monsters, the big thing it suffers from is the increasing curse, much worse through the early to mid 90s than at any other time in TSR D&D. But it suffers from an overwritten setting book. It's very common in that time. This is an early example of that. It is the opposite in that sense to what goes on with Spelljammer, where you realise you don't actually get much of a setting book. It's similar to Planescape, but less effective than Planescape's setting stuff. Unlike Planescape, and unlike Spelljammer, it has an adventure which is genuinely very good and can be with adaptation. But well, it is good with adaptation. It can become very good. And mechanically, it's very interesting. Yes, it's partly about letting your players, hey, are you a Munchkin? Come and be a Munchkin in Dark Sun. But it gives the DM the weapons, if your players like that, to create a real challenge. If your players like, I want a powerful character, I want to do cool stuff, the DM can say, great, you can do cool stuff, but this world is awful. I think Dark Sun is one of the most successful settings as a box. And I've done most of the, possibly at this point, just about a majority, maybe 50-50, of the box sets from the second edition era. I think it is one of the most successful. By that I mean world box sets, not smaller box sets. It's one of the most successful of those, possibly the most. I think the rival, or the rivals, would be Birthright and Planescape, and I think it comes with a better adventure than either, and I think mechanically it is probably more, in the core set, the core box, more distinct and complete from the off. Birthright, the chief mechanical thing is to do with the domain game, so you need to want to enjoy that. That's a subsystem rather than the kind of main game itself. And Planescape, actually, apart from large amounts of rules interpretation, doesn't have loads of brand new things for, it has factions rather than kits, basically. That's the big thing in Planescape. So yeah, that's Dark Sun first edition. What do you think of it? What are your experiences of playing in Dark Sun? What are your favourite Dark Sun products? I guess other things you'd like to see from Dark Sun reviewed. Tell me in the comments. Till next time.